Okay, let's open in a word of prayer. Lord, thanks for this day. We pray that you always help us to remember the reason for this day and every day is that your Son, that you rose from the dead triumphantly on this day. Always help us to remember that. Bless our time together today. In Jesus' name, amen. If you'll give me just 1 second here, I have one more slide to insert. Oh, my goodness. This has been a difficult week. I wish you could pray for me. I am, shall we say, extremely tired. Not tired of doing this, but just tired. It becomes increasingly difficult to keep up. And I'm trying to prepare about 10 talks while I go through these things. So that's a bit of a daunting task, plus doing all the other stuff that comes up in life. So today we're going to call this reordering, and part of the reason for that is because there's been a reordering. Did I hear somebody say something? Oh, there's been a reordering of the world system. I'm sorry, I thought I heard somebody shout something back there. And
I don't recognize this song.
Oh, it's my. What is this? I have no idea who. Leave me alone. I thought somebody was yelling at me. It's wife in a pocket here. So I'm not sure how that came about, but we're very professional here. We have everything just like a studio. So just a couple updates. So if I did a 2-hour interview with Andy White on Open Up the Doors podcast this week. You can find that on Rumble. If you need the link, you can email us and we'll get you the link. But it's on Rumble, Open Up the Doors. And then tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern U.S. time, I'm going to do Stand Up for the Truth with David Fiorazzo, Q90fm.com, Q90fm.com. And we'll talk about AI and some of these things that I've been talking about. I'm going to try to talk maybe a little bit less about it this week, although there's some things I think I should go into. And then May 5th and 6th, I'll be doing Last Days Bible Conference in Canada with Carl Kirby and some other people, ldbc.ca. I do not know if that will be live streamed. You'll have to go to their website and see about that. And then I'll be in Scotland for a Moriel conference June 16 to 18. And then also I think I'm going to speak at a church in Yorkshire, England, the week before that. So just some of those things coming up. And pray for me that I'll get the time to make these talks like I want. Talk about acceleration, convergence, logistics, understanding. We also look at these verse every week in Daniel chapter 12 because I think it's very applicable now. We know that things as we get closer to the end will become clear to us exactly how they're going to work out. And the reason why I titled this thing Reordering this week is in part because of this, because while we will have better understanding, you need to understand that things are changing in the world. There has been a complete reordering of the world order in the past 4, 5, 6 months. I don't know that it's not going to change even more beyond that. And so some of these things are very significant. So this is a little graphic I did that, Jerusalem is going to be a cup of trembling. And this week, and I'll spend a little time at the end talking about Jerusalem because it really was the epicenter of a lot of the things that went on this week. I don't remember, I think I talked about this some last week. It's hard to remember what I talked about because I've been talking too much, I guess. But I think the significance of this thing with former President Trump and the indictment in New York, and I did talk about it on the podcast that I did this week, and I also did a podcast on Hope for Our Times. It'll be hopeforourtimes.com with Tom Hughes this past Wednesday. We talked some about this Trump indictment. So in case you haven't heard that, just let me say this quickly. this is a bunch of nonsense. Even in the New York Times this morning on their main editorial page, they had 4 opinions, and everybody says, oh, it's very serious. This is just terrible what President Trump has done, former President Trump has done. But then there was one editorial there that said, this is just a bunch of nonsense. This is legal nonsense. This is a prosecutor that's completely out of control. In fact, this is Alan Dershowitz. He wrote this article at Newsweek. And I don't remember if I talked about this last week, but, he thinks that Trump will be convicted, but that Trump will win on appeal. Sometimes as a lawyer, you have to tell your client, you're not going to win this case in front of a jury, but I'm pretty sure you'll win on appeal. And I remember doing that a couple of times, and it turned out, fortunately, I was right, that the Court of Appeals did overturn it. And so I think that some court somewhere is going to get a hold of this and dismiss it. I doubt that the trial court judge in Manhattan will do that because it would be too difficult. I even doubt that he's going to change jury, even though he should. But even Dershowitz said, and I heard an interview with him this week, that the problem is that the legal system has been weaponized against political opponents of the president. And we see this on so many different levels. We see this with the misinformation, disinformation campaign to suppress certain voices on social media. It's really, I don't know how to say it other than it's really out of control at this point. I know that people have YouTube channels like we do. We watch what we've been trained. We watch what we say because YouTube will come back and ding us. Andy White on Open Up the Doors that I talked with this week, he had mentioned something related to Charlie Vector on a podcast a year and a half ago. He received a notice from YouTube this week that we've given you a strike for misinformation, for violating our community standards. He communicated with YouTube. What did I do? What did I say? Nobody responded. We got a notice about 10 days ago that one of our videos from about 2 years ago had been taken down by YouTube. But they said, we're not giving you a strike. When you get a strike, you can't post for a week. And then a second strike, you can't post for 2 weeks. And you get a third strike and your channel is gone. It's complete. They just yank the whole thing down, everything. And so you lose, all your subscribers, everything that you've done, all of your content. So that's why we post on Vimeo, live stream, and some other platforms. So we have a backup of the things that we've done in case somebody wants to go back and look at it. But they never tell you they didn't tell us what it was that we said that was wrong 2 years ago. Now, I think it related to Charlie Vector. That's just my guess. But they said, well, you may not have known that it would violate our community standards. Yeah, because you had no community standards at the time. So this is, in the terms of the law, this is a great injustice. This is a retroactive application of laws to something that you did in the past. And we lawyers know that you just can't do that. You can make laws retroactive, but you have to make a very specific application of it. But in the tech world, they just don't really care. And so one hopes that someday somebody will do the same thing to them. And I may have mentioned this last week again, and I apologize if I did. This guy put up a meme, his name Mackey. He put up a meme and said, hey, all you people who want to vote for the former Secretary of State in the 2016 election, be sure to tweet her name and your vote will count. And it was clearly a joke. But he was tried under a former old Ku Klux Klan statute about suppressing voters, because I guess people who would vote for her would believe something like that. He's now facing 10 years in federal prison. It's a terrible thing. Now let me move forward here. talk about transgender stuff. Well, let's talk about this first. Oh, this was an important decision. You're going to see a lot of editorials about this. What happened in Wisconsin? So in Wisconsin, they had an election for people on the Supreme Court. The lady who won, I can't remember her name. It's spelled like a typical Wisconsin name. A lot of, P's and W's and no vowels or too many vowels and that type of thing, and not very many other letters. But this was a very important election, and she won, and she ran on abortion. The Wall Street Journal last week, I don't have any graphics prepared for this, did release the results of a survey. The survey showed that traditional American values like belief in God, the importance of religion and that type of thing have, for lack of a better term, they've cratered. For example, it used to be that people would be, and I'm just going to pull a number, I think this is sort of accurate, 60% used to believe that religion or God was important. That number is now down below 40% in the survey. Now, a lot of people are questioning this methodology of the survey and that type of thing, but listen, if you look around culture, it seems that the results of this survey are pretty accurate. People do not hold to the values that they used to hold. We see this happening on so many levels. So this judge, she ran on the abortion. I'm going to protect the right to abortion because there's some legislation pending or there's some cases that are trying to apply old Wisconsin laws that prohibited abortion to current conduct. And the laws are still valid. She ran against a conservative and she won by 10 points. This is happening everywhere. If you remember when I was at that debate for the J.D. Vance debate against Tim Ryan on Fox News, the people on the left that were invited to into that panel that I sat on, they were concerned about abortion. That was central to what they were talking about, or what they were going to do in voting. And I think conservatives and others, religious conservatives, have not really fully understood what 50 years of Roe has done to the psyche of Americans. That simply overturning Roe and overturning Casey, which gave essentially unrestricted rights to abortion in the United States, that's not going to go away anytime soon. That takes a whole long retraining process, a lot of prayer, a lot of work, a lot of instruction. It's changed dramatically. This is another thing. This is Ed Stetzer. Now, I think I read, Ed Stetzer is one of the big, church growth types in the church, in the so-called evangelical church. He's been with the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton. I thought I read someplace that he got a new position, but I don't, he was going to some other school of theology to head it up. But I may be incorrect on that. But here's something that he put out this week. He put out a tweet by a pastor, Matt Brown. I don't know who this guy is. It comes from a church leaders podcast. That's a podcast that Stetzer did because he's like Andy Stanley is big on leadership. Ed Stetzer is big on leadership. Rick Warren is big on leadership. But what he says here is he tweets with approval, this tweet retweets what Matt Brown said, that the Enneagram has been life-changing for him and his church. Now, I talked about the Enneagram a couple years ago. You can go back and find that podcast, that video that I did. I think it was about almost 2 years ago this month. I titled it Practice Biblical Distancing, because there's certain things we should stay away from. I was looking at some of the comments about what Ed Stetzer said. And by the way, this is promoted by a bunch of people. I know that the big chapel at Liberty, at the Convocation Chapel that they had a few years ago, they pushed the Enneagram on people. It's an unbiblical concept. It's not a personality test. It has no valid data behind it. One of the big pushers of it is a guy named Richard Rohr. And one of the comments on this particular tweet said, well, I learned a lot about this from a Christian perspective from Richard Rohr. Listen, Richard Rohr is not a Christian. And the fact that somebody does not realize what Richard Rohr really teaches is very troubling. You have to be very careful. I mean, we try to warn about these things. Richard Rohr believes in he's a universalist. Everyone's going to be saved. Christ is in everything. He's a big follower of Merton and Keating, who are big in the spiritual transformation movement that has sort of overtaken most evangelical seminaries by this point. And I was speaking out about that 10 years ago. And guess what? It didn't work because most of the schools have fallen for it. So here, and this has been promoted, this Enneagram. You can get Marcia Montenegro and Don Benoit's book on the subject about the Enneagram. They go through in detail. This thing, it has New Age roots, mystical roots. It's not Christian by any stretch of the imagination. And the fact that it's pushed by guys like Richard Rohr ought to be a huge red flag, but nobody ever seems to take notice of that. There's a local church down the road, big church, maybe the biggest of the Vineyard Movement churches. And he's not the senior pastor there anymore, used to invite Jim Wallace from Sojourners to come and speak. Jim Wallace, I don't use the H word too often, if you listen to me. Jim Wallace is a heretic. Jim Wallace is a radical socialist, Marxist, non-Christian. And they would invite him to speak at the Vineyard. I saw a quote of him. I wish I had the video teed up to play for you this morning. After the shooting in Nashville, where this transgender person went in and shot up the school, killed 3 children and 3 adults, 6 people altogether. Have you watched how this has been flipped? What they're saying about this? The victim now is the shooter. And Jim Wallace came out. I saw him. This heretical, evil man said that what happened in Nashville was the fault of Christians. I heard it. And yet the Vineyard down here invited him to speak. They invited Richard Foster. I went to it. Richard Foster I question whether he's a Christian. He's into mysticism. He's the one who said in one of his books about contemplative prayer, before you do this, you need to pray prayers of protection because you might encounter some bad forces. Now listen, if it was biblical, why do you need to pray a prayer of protection to pray? And yet they had I went that night. I went to hear it. They had 2,500 people at least down there. They required all their leaders to come listen to Richard Foster. So don't think that this stuff is just off in someplace like California or someplace like that. It's right here in our community that we need to stand up against. So the Enneagram, Andy Stanley pushes it, a whole bunch of people push it, and it's not remotely biblical. And I guess from my way of thinking, if you're pushing something like this, it's a red flag to be very careful with almost anything that you're talking about. Listen, if we ever started pushing something like that around here, get rid of us. Stop listening to us, because I think it's that serious. Now, I'm going to play a clip of this. This is a pastrix of a church in Fargo, St. Mark's English Evangelical Lutheran Church. So that it's not evangelical, it's not Lutheran, and when they combine the two, it's really not that. United Lutheran Church of America, Fargo, North Dakota, and she says, she goes by they, them pronouns. She was recently installed as and listen to how this blurb from an article says this, was recently installed as the pastor of St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Fargo and delivered their first Easter-themed sermon to a small congregation on April 2nd. I hope it's small. After listening to a little bit of this, I'm going to play a little bit of it. I hope it's zero. It should be zero that listen to this. Listen to this.
This week, we witnessed yet another mass shooting, roughly the 130th this year, this time at a small private school in Nashville, Tennessee. And instead of focusing on ways this could have been prevented, such as gun control, a significant number of people have turned their attention toward the shooter's identity. Instead of focusing on the fact that the number one cause of child death in this country is now gunshot wounds, some folks have chosen to focus on eradicating trans people as a solution because they have been waiting, just waiting for an opportunity such as this. They have been waiting for a reason, any reason, to stoke their hatred. Marginalized folks, those of us with the least amount of privilege and power, they need those who have more privilege and power than they do to physically place their bodies between them and the people, powers, and institutions that are literally killing them. Yet so often they are betrayed with a kiss, right? Self-proclaimed allies and advocates will say the right things, maybe give a little money here and there, maybe show up to a protest or two, but then when push comes to shove, suddenly their hands are tied and they can't do anything. The disciples were afraid to even be associated with Jesus, lest they suffer the same fate, lest their bodies be put at risk. I have observed that it is often the people with the most power and privilege who desert those they are called to defend when those people start getting harassed, beaten, arrested, targeted, because while many of them know they won't suffer the same fate, they do know that being associated with marginalized people puts their reputation at stake. And what is it about this reputation that makes it so precious?
Well, she goes on to compare the shooter to Jesus. This is Romans 1 in operation. This is a judgment of God that people like this. I don't know of anyone who said to eradicate people. It's to evangelize them, pray that they get saved, pray that they change, that they're transformed. Every now and then you run into trans people. And I'm sad. I don't want to eradicate them. I would like to help them in some way. But you can't even say that in this culture because of what's happened and because of people, so-called pastors like this. So pray for this lady. I pray for them. She uses they, them. I don't understand. The whole thing is upside down. And part of this is the plan, is to completely ruin language, the way we lose language and that type of thing. In Ontario, they're proposing bills. This is a website, a tweet by a member of parliament in Ontario, Canada, and listen to what she had to say about the legislation that they want to put in place there.
Speaker, I have received a deluge of hate this past few days, specifically because I dare stand up for our communities and your communities, because it's happening right across Ontario. I dare to stand up to intimidation, to hateful speech, to death threats and harassment, all because I want to defend the rights of LGBT people in Ontario. And I have a message for those who are trying to shut us down, to try to push us back into the closet. We're only going to get louder, we're only going to get prouder, we're only going to get more visible, we're only going to get more fabulous, we're only going to throw out a lot more glitter, we're only going to get queer. We're not going back into the closet, we're not going anywhere. As a matter of fact, we're going to continue to stand and fight.
And she goes on, and you notice how she uses an acronym 2SLGBTQI+. 2S means two-spirit. This comes out of a claim out of Native American culture that people have both male and female, and you can determine what spirit you are. I don't even know where to go into. This is something you need to be aware of. This is the Restrict Act that's being proposed in the Senate of the United States. This is ostensibly to ban TikTok, but I don't know that it doesn't really specifically do that in the act. And so I'm afraid that it's going to be a very overbroad act, sort of like the Patriot Act was back after 9/11, and it's going to be used for nefarious purposes. Like, we don't need to worry about this administration, right, doing things for nefarious purposes. I mean, I don't even know how to describe what I think sometimes, or communicate. I don't know if I'm able to use the right words to communicate to you what I think when I see the press secretary defending these particular rights. You know, there's a big controversy now. The Biden administration came out this week with a proposal to, once again, they're sort of allowing college sports organizations to ban trans men who are pretending to be women from competition. In some cases, as long as, well, if it's not safe. So, I mean, we've seen the examples. For example, there was a man who was pretending to be a woman in hockey, was allowed to participate in a tournament, and he checked a woman into the boards and he almost killed her. Same thing in this mixed martial arts or ultimate fighting. There was a man in the women's category and went up against one of the best women in the world and just about beat her to death. And she said, I was terrified. I've never been assaulted like that. And that's her life as she gets assaulted in the ring. But I was so overpowered. She said, I've never felt overpowered like that. And people, they act like there's nothing wrong with this. And so there's a radicalization that occurred. And the way I think part of it is to get down to children. So let me make a couple comments about AI. This is an artificial intelligence index report. You can see the people that are participating in this: Google, OpenAI, Open Philanthropy is kind of interesting one. Analytics and research partners, LinkedIn, McKinsey. You can see all these people, and they go through and they analyze some of the things, and they go through a very long timeline of what's new in AI. And they start back in 2022, and you can see that DeepMind releases AlphaCode and the things that happen. So just a year ago, there were just these things starting to be released. Meta came out with some things and some developments. There was a thing released this last year called DALL-E, DALL-E, that allows the generation, using artificial intelligence, to generate images, 3D images, that sort of thing. And what it can do is pretty amazing. I have not messed around with it. I have concerns about it. And I sit here sometimes and I have these ideas for some graphics that I want to use in my updates and prophecy timelines and that type of thing. And I will be honest with you, sometimes I sit there literally for a couple hours trying to figure out one slide. How do I take what I think and put it onto a slide in a visual? I don't know if it would be easier if I used one of these tools to do that, but people are using it for everything. It's coming about very, very quickly. And then just in November 30th, you can see here on the left, OpenAI launched ChatGPT, and I talked a lot about this last week. So we're just 4 months, not even 4 months into, I guess we're a little over 4 months into the launch of one of the more significant tools. Now they've come out with GPT-4, which is 100 times more powerful, and by December, they're in the process of training something called GPT-5 that they anticipate releasing in December. That will be many, 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 many times more powerful than GPT-4. And everybody's concerned about it. Even the Financial Times last week had a article on it, a big editorial, AI's existential threat to humanity. And I've shared a lot with you last week, the open letter that's been put in place to maybe we need to slow this down, to Eliezer Ludkowski's, I can't remember how I say it, Ludkowski's warning that, listen, we need to shut this down completely. And this is one of the biggest transhumanists on the planet. He's been at this for decades. He says, shut it down. And if people don't shut it down, go launch airstrikes against their facilities where they store their hardware. Now, I don't think, this is the editorial in the Financial Times a week ago, multiple red flags are not yet slowing down the generative AI train. People are a lot of people concerned about it. Some of the developers are concerned about it, or at least they're feigning that they're concerned. They're pretending that they're concerned about it. But it's moving forward. And the question is anybody going to stop it? And I have well, I'll go to this right now. This was an article that was in Foreign Affairs in their one of their recent magazines, publications. Innovation Power, Why Technology Will Define the Future of Geopolitics. Now, you can disagree with Foreign Affairs. It's published by the Council on Foreign Relations, and they're big globalists, one world order type, new world order type people. But I think you need to read what they're saying on occasion to find out where they think this is going. And they talk about this. They use the example of Russia-Ukraine war that, well, here's what it said. When Russia forces marched on Kyiv in February 2022, few thought Ukraine could survive. Russia had more than twice as many soldiers as Ukraine. Its military budget was more than 10 times as large. The U.S. intelligence community estimated that Kyiv would fall within 1 to 2 weeks at most. Outgunned and outmanned, Ukraine turned to one area in which it held an advantage over the enemy: technology. Shortly after the invasion, the Ukrainian government uploaded all its critical data to the cloud so that it could safeguard information and keep functioning even if Russian missiles turned its ministerial offices into rubble. The country's Ministry of Digital Transformation, which Ukrainian President Zelensky had established just 2 years earlier, repurposed its e-government mobile app, DIIA, for open source intelligence collection so that citizens could upload photos and videos of enemy military units. With their communications infrastructure in jeopardy, the Ukrainians turned to Starlink satellites and ground stations provided by SpaceX to stay connected. When Russia sent Iranian-made drones across the border, Ukraine acquired its own drones specifically designed to intercept their attacks, while its military learned how to use unfamiliar weapons supplied by Western allies. And the result of this was that Ukraine was able to take what it had and make it much more effective. So Ukraine has, in effect, become a laboratory for militaries around the world, including those that are invading Ukraine. And the Iranians who are providing drones to Russia are getting a lot of intel, real world intel and data on how their drones are functioning, what they need to do to tweak it, what they need to do to make them more effective, because Iran has a major enemy that they're trying to go against, and that's Israel. So that's a big deal. The other thing that we also see the coming of the central bank digital currencies. This was the World Government Summit in 2022. This is Pippa Malmgren, and I've played this clip a number of times, but I think it's pretty significant to what she says about the development of central bank digital currencies. So understand that you have all of this stuff is being digitized. You have health passports, you have digital identity, and everybody has a digital identity, by the way. The goal to get everybody a digital identity is really a goal to get the last billion people that don't yet have a digital identity, last billion people in the world that don't have a digital identity, to have a digital identity. You have a digital identity whether you like it or not. In fact, you can be standing up speaking to a crowd, and Siri can be saying, "I don't understand what you're saying," to you. Even I never use that. Somebody's listening. I mean, so I'm a golfer. I was looking for a new putter, because I'm just missing a little bit. So it's not me. I'm sure it's the putter. Well, I get ads all the time for new putters. It's just, it's like somebody's listening. So this is coming in central bank digital currencies. And so this is just a couple video clips, and I'll talk about a new development in that area. It's coming more quickly than we think. Some people said it was going to be here this past December. I thought that was a little bit advanced, a little too soon. But here's Pippa Malmgren at the World Government Summit in the United Arab Emirates in Dubai about a year ago, speaking about central bank digital currencies. And the title of the seminar, by the way, was, and Becky, I can't remember her last name, the host, she comes out, "Excellencies, are you ready for a new world order?" They talk about this all the time. And so I know that when I talk about this now, we're starting to get tagged by YouTube that, well, this is a big conspiracy theory. Okay, well, why don't you tag their video? Their whole title of their seminar was, "Are you ready for a new world order?" And I don't see a tag on theirs. So I'm not sure how you do that. So here's Pippa Malmgren. She's a banker.
What underpins a world order is always the financial system. What we're seeing in the world today, I think, is we are on the brink of a dramatic change where we are about to, and I'll say this boldly, we're about to abandon the traditional system of money and accounting and introduce a new one. And the new accounting is what we call blockchain. It means digital. It means having a almost perfect record of every single transaction that happens in the economy, which will give us far greater clarity over what's going on. It also raises huge dangers in terms of the balance of power between states and citizens. In my opinion, we're going to need a digital constitution of human rights if we're going to have digital money. But also, this new money will be sovereign in nature. Most people think that digital money is crypto and private, but what I see are superpowers introducing digital currency. The Chinese were the first. The US is on the brink, I think, of moving in the same direction. The Europeans have committed to that as well. And the question is, will that new system of digital money and digital accounting accommodate the competing needs of the citizens of all these locations so that every human being has a chance to have a better life? Because that's the only measure of whether a world order really serves.
So in connection with that, this was released in October by the White House, the AI Bill of Rights, making automated systems work for the American people. But listen, this stuff is just lip service. Nobody really talks about this. All they talk about is further restricting people who are saying things that they don't want you to say. And if they don't like it, they'll indict you. By the way, there was a recent development with regard to a thing that happened in DC a year, 2 years ago now? The demonstrations was called an insurrection. By the way, did you see what happened in Tennessee last week? They've expelled 2 of the legislatures. They'll probably bring them back in because they're getting a lot of heat about it. But that really was an insurrection. And I'm not saying that back on the one that happened a couple of years ago, that there weren't people that did things that they shouldn't be punished for. But one of the main charges that people are getting out of that incident at the U.S. Capitol is obstructing an official proceeding. There was a recent ruling, kind of interesting ruling at the Court of Appeals. It was a 2-to-1 decision. People were challenging that, like, we weren't really obstructing anything. And the court has sort of indicated that, well, yeah, we're going to let these charges go, but there's this other issue out there, like it seems like the statute requires you to have, you can do this, you can be charged with something if there's something that benefits you, if you have a personal benefit coming out of it. That I don't think the prosecution can prove, and a lot of these charges might get dismissed. But a lot of people have felt compelled to plead guilty. They get charged with these felonies and they're facing 40 years in prison. They're facing bankruptcy from legal fees. So they plead guilty. A number of people have done that. And this is part of the reason why they take one essential transaction with regard to former President Trump and they turn it into 34 felonies. This is ridiculous. Dershowitz said this is the most amateurish thing he's ever seen. And he's no fan of President Trump. So this is a very difficult time. So this is Augustus Carstens. I have a number of videos of him that I've prepared. He's with the Bank of International Settlements, and he's a big proponent of digital currencies. And this is what he said. This was October of 2021, so about a year and a half ago. He talked on a Zoom call, it looks like, and he was talking about why he would like to see central bank digital currencies come. Listen to this.
Our analysis on CBDC, in particular for the use of general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash, and there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also we will have the technology to enforce that. Those 2 issues are extremely important, and that makes a huge difference with respect to what cash is.
So they want, what did he say? And he was reading it, total control over everything. We want to know everything that's happening in the financial system. And now you might spend cash, and we don't really know that you spent the cash. We just don't know who spent that $100 bill or that $10 bill. But with central bank digital currency, we will know. I think what they're going to do is going to shove everything to a point of sale control. So whether you use cash or not is going to be irrelevant. Now, one of the things that are coming out is a thing called FedNow service, which is to sort of allow for instantaneous transfers of money back and forth in the banking system. Right now, there's a bit of a delay in settlements and that type of thing. Unless, as we experienced recently, if the bank wants to take money out of your account, they do it right away. It just happens. But like in our case, they took out like $5,000 that they shouldn't have. And when PM asked a question about it, it's like, well, we'll put it back in 4 to 5 business days. It was like, well, wait, it was just like you just flipped a little switch and you took it out. Why can't you just unflip the switch or, reverse it? Well, we'll get it done in 4 to 5 business days. We're busy, So we all want this instantaneous thing, and you see Panera's now got the Amazon Wave, pay by palm or whatever, wave your hand and pay. JP Morgan is coming out with a bunch of things, but the FedNow service is a central bank way to do instantaneous transfers of money for merchants. If you look back at some of the old Bank for International Settlements publications that they put out, in one of them they said, this is a few years ago, the whole reason why central banks came into existence was for payments, to handle payments and transfers of money at the merchant level. So now they have this technology that's being developed where they're going to be able to, blockchain what was private crypto, now they're going to put into central bank digital currencies. And my fear is that when they do that, they're going to just completely wipe out crypto. I think that's what they would like to do because they want to have control. So the FedNow service is going to roll out. You can see this. There's a Money and Payments, the US dollar in the age of digital transformation, a publication from January 2022. It tells you how these payment transactions work. Here's another publication, The Future of Money and Payments. This is something that came out from the US Department of Treasury pursuant to a executive order talking about the payment systems and how this is what was the reason for central banks, and now we have central bank digital currencies, and everybody in the world is doing this. This is a publication, the digital rupiah. This is from Indonesia, Project Garuda, navigating the architecture of the digital rupiah from the Bank of Indonesia. They're going to do this. This is another thing. JP Morgan joins the biometric palm and face ID race. So the JP Morgan has that, they got office buildings. Well, they have buildings all over. I don't know if they're buildings where people still go to work. This is, by the way, on the financial system, this is becoming a big deal. I see more and more people talking about it. I've been mentioning it for a couple of years. I don't know that commercial office buildings are worth what they were worth 2 years ago. I drive by some of these buildings during the day. I don't see people working in these office buildings. I'll drive by a big office building and I'll go over to the golf course for a driving range, and there's more cars in the parking lot at the driving range than there are at the office buildings. So people will just say, well, you're addicted to golf or whatever, but that's ridiculous. That's just silly. But regional banks are having problems. There's also this prepare for a multipolar currency world. People are getting away from the dollar. That's happening everywhere. That transformation is taking root very quickly. A few weeks ago, Xi and Putin met in Moscow. Pretty sure it was Moscow. And on the way out, this is a little thing that's doing, and this is Xi talking to Putin. We're seeing a change we haven't seen, and you'll see this repeated. We haven't seen the change we haven't seen for 100 years. And we're driving this change together. And Putin says, I agree. And they're changing things. Transactions that used to be only done or denominated in US dollars are now being done in digital yuan, the Chinese currency. It's changing things. There's a company called the BRICS. This is a pretty good article from the Cradle, and I think they're probably a center-left or anti-American organization, but I think they got great graphics. That's one reason why I like them. But they're talking about the fact that, listen, this thing is changing. The world order is changing. Xi says, when we are together, we drive these changes. China recently settled its first liquefied natural gas trade in yuan. The Brazilians have been brought into this as well. Don't think that what happened in the election in Brazil last fall was not part of this whole process. Now we have this agreement between China has brokered a normalization agreement. I don't know if I'd call it a peace agreement, but it's certainly a normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And part of the deal was that Saudi Arabia has been brought into the Shanghai Cooperative Organization. That's an organization, all those countries in red are part of the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, the SCO. The ones in green have observer status. So you see Mongolia has observer status, Pakistan has observer status, Turkey, but that's a big chunk of the world. It's like half of the world now is under this Shanghai Cooperative Organization. Is this one of the regional things of the 10-beast kingdom of the end times? I don't know. We'll watch and see. But I think it's significant the way that this has really come together. So this is kind of an interesting thing. This is a little video about submarine cables. So it shows how these cables have grown as the internet has grown. This is a very interesting graphic because it shows like what's good. Look how quickly these came about. You don't even know this, well, because you're not driving around the ocean watching people lay cable everywhere. But understand that, sort of like pipelines for gas and oil, these things can be attacked too in a war. And what happens if you lose the internet? And you all know it happens. The power goes out, or your internet provider has a glitch, or they might get subject to a cyber attack or something like that, and you don't have internet for 20 minutes. And then my wife's waving her, oh no, the world's... Yeah, I stay very calm when that happens, by the way. But, so these submarine cables this is a big deal, and there's been some that have been cut. There was one island, I forget where it was, it recently had its internet cable cut. They couldn't repair it. They evacuated everybody off of the island. Very significant. So I mentioned this. This is something to keep track of. This is this article by Pepe Escobar at the Cradle, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Chinese win-win. China all of a sudden is now like they're the great purveyors of peace in the world. What? This has just happened in a month. This is what Escobar says in this article. And again, he's, I think, anti-American, so I think that's his orientation. The idea that history has an endpoint as promoted by clueless neoconservatives in the unipolar 1990s is flawed, as it is an endless process of renewal. The recent official meeting between Saudi Foreign Minister Faisal bin Farad al-Saud and Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian in Beijing marks a territory that was previously deemed unthinkable and which has undoubtedly caused grief for the War Inc. machine. By the way, do you think that war is going to stop because China is now involved with Iran and Saudi Arabia? No. By the way, part of what's happening now too is that Saudi Arabia appears to be on the verge of at least having a ceasefire or peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and the Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis are supported by Iran. They have the capability, they've just demonstrated the capability that they attack buildings in the United Arab Emirates with drones and missiles, I think drones, which is about the same distance from the Houthis in Yemen to the United Arab Emirates as it is from the Houthis in Yemen to Israel. And the world, with all of this thing, for in terms of Israel's security and safety, has really, really changed. And they had meetings this week where they signed this. They also had, Macron was in China, along with the head of the European Union, von der Leyen. And she was sort of almost excluded from the meetings, but Xi just pretty much dissed these guys and said, listen, we're going to do what we want to do. And maybe we'll think about what you guys want us to think about. This is another article related to property. Banking turmoil hammers European property stocks. You're going to see a lot of those articles. This is something I meant to mention at the earlier part. It's interesting. It shows the conflict and division in our culture over certain issues. So they have the abortion pill, mifepristone. So a judge in Texas said, it's not valid, you can't use it anywhere. Same day, a judge in Washington or Oregon says, you can use it. So now you have two federal judges that are clashing, and the question is, it's going to end up at the Supreme Court. How is the Supreme Court going to rule? This will be a big issue in the next election, especially if the Supreme Court comes out and says this drug should not be approved. That's going to be used to elect people that oppose to that. Israel's in a difficult spot. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Israel, and then we're actually going to finish up here. I was going to say we're going to finish up early, but that never happens, does it? So this is an important article. Caroline Glick has picked up on this article. It's by Tony Badrin. It was in the tablet about March 8th, so about a month ago. The point of the article was Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States, builds a Palestinian Hezbollah in the West Bank. And let me see if I can pull this up here, because I think there's a couple things that are important to read out of the article. Let's see here. Okay. So here's what Tony Badrin says. He's a Middle East security expert. I forget which, he's with one of the think tanks. While the Biden administration has been busy encouraging and funding the Israeli protest movement against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's proposed judicial reforms, it has also launched a far more potentially dangerous and lethal attempt to destabilize the leading military power in the Middle East. The wave of domestic protests in Israel comes on the heels of the most deadly series of Palestinian terror attacks since the end of the Second Intifada, which was back about 2002 to 2003. Incredibly, the U.S. is now proposing to take advantage of its allies' political weakness by standing up a potential 5,000-man Palestinian terror army that would ostensibly fight terrorism in the West Bank in place of the IDF. So they're going to train 5,000 Palestinian soldiers to be in this ostensibly an anti-terror organization. They're being trained in Jordan. There's been meetings about this between U.S. military personnel and Jordanian military personnel and Palestinian, and I think even some of the Israeli people have been involved. Washington, D.C.'s latest bout of Mideast pyromania began with U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's to Ramallah at the end of January, right after a Palestinian terrorist shot dead 7 Israelis outside a synagogue. Naturally, the Secretary of State came bearing condolence gifts, which were what? A lot more money for the Palestinian Authority, an agreement to provide 4G communications in the West Bank, an initiative from U.S. Ambassador Tom Needis, which he pounded the table in order to get rolling, even as there are concerns that an advanced ICT structure might complicate efforts by Israeli security to monitor terrorist communications, and a commitment to reopen the U.S. consulate in East Jerusalem. In other words, everything that the current government in Israel would be against, our government is trying to promote. Caroline Glick, she also picked up on this, and in her article, she talked about a guy named Hadi Amir, A-M-R, who is really one of the guys behind this. And to kind of give you an example of what he did, you remember there were 2 brothers who were shot and killed by Palestinian terrorists, 2 Jewish brothers shot and killed by Palestinian terrorists in Huwara, H-U-W-A-R-A. When Amir came to the West Bank, he went there, but he didn't go there for that because the Jewish settlers got upset and they went in and they trashed the place. They did. They were upset that two of their people had been killed. And I understand that. I'm not justifying what they did. I'm just saying is they had people killed. So what did our representative do? He's an undersecretary of state. He went to the Palestinians and said, oh, it's so bad that the Jewish settlers came in here and did this. And to my knowledge, saying anything about the two Jewish people who'd been killed never crossed his lips. And this is part of a campaign that's going on by the Biden administration in that area. So now we have, this is from Al Mayadeen TV channel. It's an Iranian TV channel in Lebanon. And you can see here, this is the Arabic on the left and the English on the right. And it says, Israel is eroding. And you see the pictures. It's always Ben-Gvir, who's the director of security, I think minister of security, internal security in Israel, and Netanyahu. They talk about thousands of protests. And so the people are, this is what it says, Israel's eroding. Demonstrations are escalating in Israel against the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, especially on the issue of judicial amendments. While the circle of protests is widening, concern is growing among Israelis that matters may lead to civil war or to various security repercussions. And it's a theme now, and I read through a lot of Arabic and Iranian newspapers this week. They're all saying Israel's falling apart. Now's the time for us to do something. So a lot of things related to the Temple Mount. There were rockets launched from the Golan in Syria, by the way, into Israel. There were also 35 rockets or so launched from Lebanon into Israel. That's the most rockets launched from Lebanon since the 2006 Second Lebanon War. Pretty significant development. Now, Israel's responded in a pretty measured response. There's a good article in the Jerusalem Post on Friday by Jonathan Spire talking about the fact that Israel made a very measured response. And so you have this, what you see this dance going on between Israel and Iran. Nobody wants to escalate it, but at some point it's going to escalate into a full-blown war. Al Mayadeen also put out a TV show where they said that all the proxies of Iran now have about 250,000 rockets aimed at Israel that they can launch. Now, some of them are not very good rockets. They just sort of hope they hit something. And there were some attacks this week where things in Israel were hit. There was a shopping center hit. There was a house hit. Iron Dome shot off, it knocked down a bunch of them. Some of them landed in open fields. And that's kind of the beauty of Iron Dome, because it's about $100,000, $50,000 to $100,000 to shoot off an Iron Dome missile to knock down a missile. So the missile they may be able to assemble for a few $1,000s, and it costs Israel $100,000 to shoot it down. So the Iron Dome is able to calculate and say, well, this is going to land in an open field, so we're not going to waste $100,000 to shoot it down. It's pretty good. There's also, Israel's trying to develop a laser system to do this, but the problem with the laser system is they have a lot of neat videos, but it's not very effective at a distance. I mean, it has to be within a half a mile of the missile to really be effective, which means that if you got missiles flying from all over, you have to have the lasers everywhere too. So even though the cost is lower, it's a logistical issue that I talk about a lot. So this week, there were these attacks in Israel. And then after prayers on Friday, a Jewish family from Efrat, where I just was in December, was driving up through the Jordan Valley, and they're on holiday. It's kind of a strange convergence because you have Ramadan ending, you have Passover, you have Christian resurrection celebrations, all of them sort of happening at the same time. And it's very tense. Remember a year ago, there was seems like it was many, many, many years ago, but I think it was just a year ago, where we had the videos, you had the Jewish people celebrating Passover at the Western Wall, but in the background you saw flames coming off of the Temple Mount. And of course, Arab media put out, oh, they're burning down Al-Aqsa Mosque. They're burning down Al-Aqsa Mosque. No, it was a tree that was caught on fire by the fireworks that you guys were shooting off. And last year, what they did was they went in and they stored rocks to throw over the side of the Temple Mount down on people worshiping at the Western Wall. They had fireworks. And they're allowed to spend the night in mosques except at the end of Ramadan, because this happens all the time. So what happened was Israel went in and took out a bunch of terrorists. And of course, the media goes, they're storming Al-Aqsa Mosque. And I saw an article in one of the Arab newspapers, I think it was from Saudi Arabia, said, oh, look, the Jewish settlers, they're storming Al-Aqsa Mosque. Well, they went up there and walked around. They didn't have weapons or anything like that. So there's this, people are really stoking the tensions. And this is a quote from Yair Lapid, who was quoted all over Arab media this week saying, the country is about to collapse. Ehud Barak, I played a clip of him last week saying, listen, this is part of the plan, is to get rid of Netanyahu. It's about judicial reform, but we really want to get rid of the Netanyahu government. And so at this intersection in the Jordan Valley, sort of between the Jordan Valley and Nablus, two young ladies and their mother, they were 16 and 20, their mother. Father was in a car ahead, and as they got to this junction, they were attacked with 22 caliber, probably from Kalashnikov weapons. They went out of control. You can see the car crashed. One of them was life flighted. The two daughters, 16 and 20, died. One died at the scene, bled to death. And you can see the picture of the windshield, if you can zoom back out on that. Zoom back out on that. There you go. That's you know what that red stuff is? That happened right at the end of prayers. This is what the Tehran Times said about Saudi Arabia. Reset after 7 years. What is it? It's a reordering of the world order because of this new normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Part of this is because the U.S. is weak. This is another headline. World end transition, our foes engulfed in crisis. They're protesting in Paris. They're protesting in Israel. Game change in Syria, Iran to boost air defense. So right in the midst of all this, these two young ladies, this is Israel Hayom, newspaper this morning, 16 and 20 years old, were killed. Their mother is in critical condition, literally fighting for her life as we speak. They were from Efrat, which is a very close community. I saw videos posted of everybody gathering in the square, in one of the squares in Efrat, praying and singing. I saw another at a community center. The women and daughters all got together to mourn and pray. This is a very, very close-knit community. This is a big deal. So this is, and so there's this explosion of things going on. Here's another article about this. Now, it's causing a lot of turmoil in Israel because people are saying, well, you know, the Netanyahu government response has not been very good. So Avigdor Lieberman, who's in the opposition, Lapid, others have said the government's just not doing a very good job. Even Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who are in the conservative, Zionist, Orthodox parties that are part of Netanyahu's coalition, have said the response has been so weak that we may have to leave the government. Which, if they leave the government, then what happens? Netanyahu's government fails. They go to more elections. They've put a pause on the judicial reforms, but that hasn't stopped the protests. They had big protests yesterday again. As I saw Carol Glick on our podcast, she said the protests usually involve anywhere from 10,000 to 3 billion people, depending on which newspaper you read, because the number always seems to grow. But so Israel went in to clear out the Al-Aqsa Mosque last night in Tel Aviv. I think it was last night, it was Friday night. An Italian tourist was there and he was run down by a car and killed. It was a terrorist attack. Pam will remember this when we were in Israel. We got stopped at a checkpoint and there were a bunch of Arab Palestinians there. And the soldiers were negotiating with our friend Joel Kramer about whether we would be able to go through the checkpoint because the West Bank was we were in Samaria coming out of Nablus and everything was pretty tense at the time. Trump was coming in a couple days. And there had been a Jewish settler had shot and killed somebody who attacked his car. And the Palestinians were upset. We were in Hebron. And the day that happened near Nablus, when we went through Nablus, you could see where they'd been burning tires and cars the day before. And then the day after we were in Hebron, they were having protests down in Hebron. Everything was very tense. But the Palestinians were there. And I will admit, at first I thought they were joking. Hey, why don't you just take that car and ram those soldiers? Just run them over. And I kind of thought they were joking, but now that I think about it no, I mean, they would get a lot of advantage out of that if an American ran down a bunch of IDF soldiers. So everything is very, very tense. But Smotrich and everything are gone. Here's the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, short interview with Al Jazeera, who is an Arab language news organization based out of Qatar, very pro-Muslim. And they're asking her questions about, listen, you guys you can listen to the interview. I think she does a fantastic job dealing with the issue.
So if I may read you.
Here we go.
The Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem joins us live now from Tel Aviv. Good to have you with us. So if I may read you a statement by the UN General Assembly Bureau Committee released on April the 5th. It says, quote, it condemns the raid by Israeli forces inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound on April the 4th. And it goes on to say, quote, Israel's illegal policies and practices have continued to entrench its illegal occupation. Do you agree that what is causing the tensions here are Israeli attempts to entrench an occupation through imposing laws and regulations and policies which are illegal?
Absolutely not. There's one very clear reason why this has happened.
So is the UN wrong then?
Exactly the same thing happened a year ago, if you let me answer the question. A year ago, on the eve of Passover and a day and a half before Easter, we had exactly the same copy-paste incidences that we've had in the last 2 days. It's the eve of Passover when Jews are beginning to prepare for their celebrations, and you had exactly the same situation last year. 350 terrorists that have been incited and called by Hamas. They barricaded themselves from the night before into the Al-Aqsa compound, desecrating the mosque with fireworks and stones, and basically impeding the peaceful worship of peaceful Muslims like we've seen for the last 3 weeks since the beginning of Ramadan. We've had hundreds of thousands of Muslims coming to the Al-Aqsa complex, to Haram al-Sharif, to pray peacefully. And this was a very well curated, produced incident in order to create the excuse to start a conflict. And we saw exactly the same thing last year and exactly the same thing the year before. So there's nothing in this story, unfortunately. And what the saddest thing is that a family has to bury their 2 daughters and the mother is fighting for their lives. A peaceful family that was driving through and got shot in cold blood. This is what we've experienced over the last 2 hours. And for
So she's exactly right. It's interesting. So I do subscribe to the Washington Post, and on their app, this is what showed up. So this is after the shooting. So this showed up on, I think the shooting took place after Friday prayers right after Friday prayers let out at the Temple Mount, at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so they had rockets coming in from Gaza, they had rockets from Lebanon and stuff. But listen to how the Washington Post describes this. Israel launches strikes on Lebanon and Gaza after rocket barrage. Now, they could have said Israel responds to a rocket barrage. The way you understand the way they use the language here. Here's another little clip. Friday prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem. This is a Washington Post. Middle East correspondents writing this. Friday prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem began amid high tensions after Israel carried out airstrikes in Lebanon and Gaza Strip early Friday, and the risk of wide-scale regional conflict grew. Israel said the strikes were in retaliation to a barrage of rockets fired from southern Lebanon and Gaza over toward Israel on Thursday and overnight. Now, what kind of journalist is this that writes this garbage? Israel said? How about report what happened? There were rockets fired from Gaza. Israel went in, people who were violating the agreements that exist between the Jordan Waqf, Jordanian-controlled Waqf, that's the Islamic organization that controls the Temple Mount. They say, we won't allow people to do this the last few days of Ramadan. And what do? Every year they go in there, they barricade themselves in, they have fireworks, they have stones. She doesn't mean little rocks. She means things that if it hits you in the head, it will kill you. That's what happened when we were in Israel. Jewish settler was attacked on a road by 400 Palestinians with rocks. And he defended himself. He shot 2 of them dead. Now, if that happened in Austin, Texas, he would be convicted of murder. Did you hear about that case? A guy during the BLM riots made a wrong turn on a street, and a guy approached him with an AK-47, pointed it right at him, and he shot him. He was convicted of murder yesterday in Austin, Texas. America. Texas. Well, Austanistan, I think it should be called. And we have family that live there now. But this is just egregious. So then they go through with a series of photos like, this is what's happening in Israel. So here's rockets from Israel and Gaza. Here's some more attacks in Gaza. Here's some more attacks in Gaza. Here's some in Lebanon. Here's some more in Lebanon. Here's some Israel strikes in Gaza. Here's some more. Here's some more. Oh, here's a rocket from Lebanon that landed in Israel. And I went through, I skipped about 4 or 5 more. And there was a grocery store law office or something that was hit up in the Galilee region. Erdogan came out. Let's have an article from him. So this relates to the Temple Mount. And this is Al Akbar newspaper. I'm going to just look at a couple clips of this. This is an article saying, listen, Israel's got judicial reform. They're falling apart. We should do this. This is a Hezbollah mouthpiece newspaper published in Lebanon. By the way, Lebanon is falling apart. Banks are closed. People don't have currency. The president of the country is getting by on less than $200 a month. The president of the country. The country's falling apart. So don't think that these rockets weren't fired from Lebanon because it was in part to distract people. Oh, look, Israel's attacking us. That's why we're falling apart. So Israel was very careful, as Jonathan Spire said in his Friday Jerusalem Post article, Israel was very careful to do a surgical, targeted strike that wasn't going to provoke a big response from Lebanon or Hezbollah. But it still may escalate. Here's another article, Conflict in the Zionism Camps. And it goes back, this article sort of traces the history of fights. But then here's this article to be up at the upper part, and here's what this article says, the Arabic part. Jerusalemites continue the battle to establish their right to perform overnight stays in the Al-Aqsa Mosque throughout the days of Ramadan, and to prevent the occupation from imposing a temporal and spatial division on it, similar to what happened in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. So what are they doing? They're tying it to the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron, and this is an article that they've shut the mosque in Hebron, or I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said mosque. It has a Jewish synagogue and a mosque there. And Israel just shut the whole thing down to everybody because of the tensions that exist right now. And Hebron is a very divided city. In fact, here's a little aerial shot of the Tomb of the Patriarchs. And you can see on the right is a mosque, on the left is a Jewish synagogue. And it's very tense there. I mean, you know, when you go through the checkpoint, Israeli soldiers are you Jewish? Are you Christians? Are you Muslim? Because they want to know. And I remember when we were there the first time, they said, do you have any knives? Because Jewish soldiers have been stabbed and killed there, I believe. So this is a very big deal. Here's a little video that sort of shows the Tomb of the Patriarchs. That's the seventh step where the Jews could only pray for about 700 years. That's one of the closed streets in Hebron. This is from Tel Rumedia, the ancient tell of the city of Hebron where David's palace was. And that's the Tomb of the Patriarchs there. So the second holiest site in Judaism. So anyway, so back to the Temple Mount. So they're saying, listen, they closed that down. They're going to close down Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel's going to close down Al-Aqsa Mosque. And look at the photograph or the graphic that they've put in this article, that you can see the Dome of the Rock there, but it's like it's the heart of Islam. Do you understand the symbolism there? This is how they think about it. And so Nasrallah is saying, listen, given the events that happened yesterday and drawn today in southern Lebanon, and given the interconnectedness of the events in Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Syria, as they all revolve around one axis and one issue, I will leave the discussion in detail until Friday. That's what he said the other day. And that would be on Al-Quds Day. Erdogan came out, who's made reaching out to Israel a big deal, and said, Islamic world should be united against Israel due to their attacks in Palestine. In fact, he had a phone call with Raisi, the president of Iran, where they talked about dealing jointly with Israel, that they needed to act together. Now, we talk a lot about Ezekiel 38 and 39, and what does that talk about? It clearly talks about two areas, two regions that are going to come against Israel in the end. And a lot of people wonder, how does this come about? How does this happen? Because Iran is largely Shia and Turkey is Sunni. And the answer is they have a common hatred, a common enemy. And it's not a surprise to me. During a telephone call with his Turkish counterpart, Erdogan, on Friday, Raisi strongly slammed the recent attacks of the Israeli forces against the Al-Aqsa Mosque as a desecration of the holy place. And then these articles in the Hezbollah newspaper go on and say, listen, the one thing that's good about all of this, it has united the entire Arab world against Israel. This is a Hezbollah newspaper. I'm just telling you, this is where this seems to be headed. Whether this is it or not, the Saudi Arabia Arab News this morning said, the resurrection of a new Middle East might be upon us. There is a genuine opportunity for the Israelis to build on the positive momentum in the region, should they want to. The U.S. has sent one of our nuclear subs with, I think it can carry 150 Tomahawk cruise missiles to the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's It's a big deal. So I'm going to talk, I'll just do this very, very quickly, and I'll finish with this, I promise, because I know everybody's got, you've missed your reservation anyway, so for lunch. So this is the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. I'm preparing a talk on it. Here's again, this is looking from the southwest towards the northeast across the Temple Mount. You see the Dome of the Rock there. You see the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the right. This is a picture of the Temple Mount from what would be across the old city today, showing the place of crucifixion there in the foreground relative to the Temple Mount at the time of Jesus. Now, some people say, well, it's the Garden Tomb, but I think it was here where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is. And that's what it would look like today. So you can kind of see how it's sort of the same direction. You see the Mount of Olives in the background. And you can see the Mount of Olives there today and all the Jewish graves up there. So here's the Temple Mount again. I looked really hard for a picture directly above. So I'm going to just explain some of the geography of the Temple Mount. My talk on Jerusalem will cover this in more detail when I'm in Canada. But there is this, it's called the Haram al-Sharif, but now it's being referred to as Al-Aqsa. Al-Aqsa used to be that building there, but now the whole compound is called Al-Aqsa. This is because why? Because this is a triumphalism of Islam to say we control everything. So the Al-Aqsa Mosque, you have the Dome of the Rock, and in between them, there's a thing called the Al-Quds Fountain. That will be important in just a moment. Now, there's different theories about where the Jewish temple was. Now, there's this eastern gate, and some people think, and there's also this thing called the Dome of the Tablets, and I'll talk a minute about this. And so a lot of people think that the temple was located there to the north. Some people say, well, you look at Revelation, it says that don't measure the outer part because it's given over to the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles will be fulfilled. So some people will say, well, the temple would be built along that red line, and then they don't need to take down the other buildings. Now, I don't know that the way things are currently configured that's going to happen. By the way, there were a bunch of Jewish conservative pro-temple people that were arrested the other day because they tried to go up and sacrifice an animal on the Temple Mount. This is all happening at the same time. This is why this is important. So you have, so there's these different views. So one view, the traditional view, is that the temple was where the Dome of the Rock is. So to build that, you got to get rid of the Dome of the Rock if you're going to build a temple. Maybe you just put up an altar, though, to do your worship, because the whole area is the holy place, I think. I don't think it's necessarily just where the temple was. The other view is, of course, here, the temple would be, the Holy of Holies would be over this thing called the Dome of the Tablets, or it would be here where the Al-Quds Fountain is. That's the southern view. And the reason for that is this view is that there is a building in Baalbek, Lebanon. Here, let me show you this. So here's the Temple Mount. This is looking to basically to the south across the Temple Mount. There's a Roman temple at Baalbek up in Lebanon around the Bekaa Valley. And it looks like this. That's a 3D representation of it and a very crude Photoshop by yours truly to try to make it show why some people think that the temple was at the Al-Quds Fountain. And you'll notice that Baalbek had a octagonal or a six-sided building. The Dome of the Rock is eight-sided. There's some evidence that it was originally a six-sided building that was there. It's now eight-sided. And then there's a temple. And you see how it's sort of where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is a temple, where the Dome of the Rock is this octagonal building, and in the middle, where the Al-Quds Fountain is, was a statue of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. So the Roman mind would be, it's sort of like the Muslims do. We're going to build on top of what you built because it's ours now. And it's essentially an act of desecration. It's why King Hussein started to build that palace on top of a place called Gibeah on the north part of Jerusalem. As you drive from Jerusalem up to Ramallah, on one of the highest, if not the highest places around Jerusalem. He was building his palace back in the 60s and had to stop because of the 6-Day War. But why was he building at Gibeah? Well, if you know Jewish history in the Bible, kudos to you, Andy Stanley, this is a factual thing that's recorded in the Bible. The first king of Israel was Saul. He was a Benjamite. What was the capital of the tribe of Benjamin? Gibeah. So Hussein built on top of Gibeah as a statement, I'm in charge now. I'm obliterating your history, and you have no more right to be here. Now the 6-Day War intervened. So this is a graphic of the ruins of Baalbek laid out on the Temple Mount. Let me do that. Okay, so here you go. There's the graphic of Baalbek. You see the octagonal building, you see the temple, and then the Emperor Hadrian statue right in the middle. And that's just in the transparency. So listen, I'll talk more about that. A lot of things are happening. So a Facebook friend of mine took this picture this week. This is one of the panels of the Dome of the Rock. Take a look at that thing. What does that look like? I've had the same picture in my collection. And inside the Dome of the Rock, in probably the oldest Quranic writings existing on the planet, along this arcade, the inner arcade and the outer arcade, are engraved parts of the Quran. It's probably the best evidence that the Quran was in existence when the Dome of the Rock was built in 691 or 692. And they say in those statements, we always talk about the abomination of desolation. There's an abomination right there, right now, on that Temple Mount that says, God has no son. That's important today, more than about any other day that we recognize on the Christian calendar. And so there are these statements. These are on the outer octagonal arcade. Same thing, God has no son. So it's there engraved in Quranic writings on the building that sits there where I think the temple used to stand. It's very interesting. So look, all of this seems to be, how quickly this comes to a head, I don't know. Things are changing very quickly. Things are being aligned like we've always talked about in Bible prophecy. And you need to prepare your hearts. Because we see attacks coming on Christians. We see Christians effectively being blamed for the shooting in Nashville, for spreading disinformation, misinformation. I think it's going to increase. So what do? You steel your heart. Harden it. You put on the whole armor of God. Not occasionally, like, okay, in 3 weeks I'm going to put on the armor. You need to do it daily. Belt of truth, helmet of salvation, on and on through Ephesians 6. And as Paul said in 1 Corinthians, you need to stand firm in the faith and act like men. It's going to be more important now than ever. So on the day that we recognize that Jesus rose from the dead, we also should recognize that he's coming back. And he's going to clean this mess up. And we should long for that day when things get redeemed and made new. So let's pray. Lord, thank you so much for your word. We pray that you'll help us to remember, especially today, the significance of the events of this day when you rose from the dead, triumphant, taking away the sting of death, dying in our place so that we could forever be in a right relationship with God. Bless us today. In Jesus' name, amen.